And welcome to a Climate Conversation podcast. This is a podcast that is a complement to the documentary Climate Conversation, which is the project of Walt Johnson. He wanted to create a documentary to just have a thoughtful conversation about these narratives that are out there regarding this important issue. And so we've got a great team here that we're working on these podcasts and a great guest. So Walt Johnson, first of all, I'm so grateful for this project that you've put together. Welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for everyone else that have really made it a good project. Thank you.
And our spokesperson is Dave O'Rourke for a Climate Conversation. And it's great to have you. You've been traveling, so it's great to have you back, Dave.
Oh, it's nice to be home. It's always fun to travel, but even the best vacations typically end with a strong desire to get back. So I'm happy to be here.
Great to have you, and really thrilled to have James Taylor as our special guest. He is president of the Heartland Institute, which is one of the leading free thinking think tanks. How's that, James Taylor? But you're doing such amazing work at the Heartland Institute.
Well, thank you, Kim. It's a pleasure to be joining you here today.
So, Dave, you've really taken a look at some key questions that you have for James. So where do you want to begin?
Well, I think that Heartland has done some profoundly positive work here, and they're at their website. You can see, you could get an introduction if you're not familiar with them already. But I think, James, if you could help us understand Heartland's sort of larger effort. You obviously had a key role in the production of this film, and we'd love to hear any anecdotes you have about that. But if you could just take us through Heartland's efforts to kind of bring some rationality and realism to this incredibly important and potentially devastatingly expensive question of energy transition. I'd love to hear about Heartland.
Yeah, well, thank you. So Heartland is a freedom-oriented public policy organization. What we do is we're basically champions of freedom, and we try to present the best information we can to the general public, to policymakers, and just do everything we can to advance the ball for freedom. So we got involved in the climate change debate back when it was known as global warming about 20 years ago. And there was this push shortly before and then during the era of Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth movie. There was a push to impose carbon dioxide taxes, carbon dioxide restrictions, renewable power mandates in state legislatures, especially because Congress would not, thankfully, Congress would not enact all of these severe restrictions. So climate activists went to the states. And we at the Heartland Institute, we have built up quite a network of relationships among state policymakers. And so for us, look, if you're baking the planet, you got to do what you got to do to make sure it doesn't happen. But when the proposed solutions all involve restrictions on freedom, not just economic freedom, but personal freedom, then we need to look under the hood to make sure it's justified. So when we did so, talking with many very prominent scientists at some of the most prominent and prestigious academic institutions and government agencies, and NASA, NOAA, many of the scientists there are climate realists. They're not alarmists. So when we delved into this more deeply, we just made a decision, hey, we have to just jump in both feet into this topic, because if we don't, this really has become this climate change issue, the Trojan horse for a dramatic, far-reaching left-wing agenda. It's no coincidence that AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, self-described socialist, when she was elected to Congress, her first signature item was the Green New Deal. It was through the environmental issue, in particular the so-called climate crisis, that she hopes to institute socialism here in America. So that's how we got involved. We've been fighting for climate realism now for over 20 years. And there's been a lot of ups and downs, quite interesting times we live in, and ultimately leading to our participation with the climate conversation. A climate conversation, I think, is a truly remarkable and I think game-changing movie. So it's great to be here with you folks today.
Well, Walt, you have a little story about getting the making of the movie and your efforts to get resources and partners going forward, and how you came in first contact with Heartland in this.
Well,
I think our listeners would love to hear that story.
first I wanted to go through a nonprofit organization. And first I contacted two nonprofit earth science related knowledge based organizations here in Denver. And I had in the past participated as a leader in these organizations. And they treated me like I had leprosy or something, that people would be mad if they involved in something like this. And everyone had the same narrative of what I wanted to say. And Heartland was really top on my list of desirable people because I followed them for several years. And at one time, almost all the opposition to the climate crisis came from Heartland. And James was very, very open, willing to be the lead nonprofit organization, which allowed me to take money out of my IRA and make this movie. And right now, it's been on Newsmax 17 times, and that has also been echoed onto Roku. So we are having an impact. It's designed in such a way that average, curious, intelligent people can understand it. So thank you very much, James. I appreciate all you've done.
Oh, the pleasure's mine.
Well, we've got a great team here today, and James, thanks so much for being here. Thanks for, by the way, I've not actually spoken with you since the event in Denver last October, the debut filming, the debut of the film at Rockley Center. And you were kind enough to come and share some remarks then. Since then, the film has garnered some very significant viewership, and I want to encourage everyone, it's my role as spokesperson, to visit www.climateconversation.com. You're probably here now watching this podcast, and that's how you got here, but it works best virally. Tell your friends and tell your neighbors and tell that kid come home for Thanksgiving from Colombia that they need to hear another set of opinions, and ones that are fact-based. And if they come to climateconversation.com, they can not only see a brilliant film, but they can now see a pretty expanded library of podcasts that feature an absolute marquee list of wonderful, thoughtful, science-based, realism-based, kind people who have their fellow citizens' best interests at heart. This is not rabble-rousing that we're doing here. This is having conversations with people so we can agree on public policy that makes sense, that when it's necessary, adapts to natural problems and human-made problems, but when it's also necessary, resists the kind of Trojan horse thing that you made reference to, James, before, where the question isn't really about the climate, isn't really about greenhouse gases. The question really is about global governance. And so finding a way to break through that, all of that noise, is incredibly important. We just had some great news about the School of Mines, Walt. I don't know if we want to mention that here on this podcast, but I thought that was very encouraging that students in geophysics are now very interested in getting a second point of view.
That school has inspired me to make the movie because they were very much on board with the climate change concerns, mostly so they could get research money to do carbon sequestration. And so, yes, it's good to have that presented up there now.
That's terrific. So recently you were in Europe, and I had the good fortune to watch a YouTube video of your presentation, which is available to anyone who wants to watch it. Just simply search on James Taylor Heartland, EAKE, E-A-K-E, right? I believe it is.
E-I-K-E. Yeah.
And there were some interesting things there. You threw down a challenge. What was it? It was like the Old West. any time, any place. Can you tell us about your presentation there and some of the key points that you made?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I was invited to speak at the ICA conference in Vienna. ICA is the European Institute for Climate and Energy, and Heartland was honored to co-sponsor that event. And I was giving a talk, basically 2 points I wanted to make. One was give an update from the United States, basically what's happening here politically and science, climate change wise. And second, to debunk some common climate myths that people hear. And what was amusing was on my flight over to Vienna, I'm just going through the internet, doing my internet search for climate change. And it's just amazing how many outright lies, falsehoods are presented every day on this topic to try to bring people to fear and alarm. So just on the flight, there were 3 of them that stood out to me that had just been published during the past week in the mainstream media. One was a claim that Antarctic ice is growing dramatically. And there was an article that explicitly called out the Heartland Institute, called us peddling misinformation for saying the opposite. Another topic in the media was that climate change is destroying all the finer things in life that people enjoy. And there was a particular mention of cocoa for hot chocolate and chocolate bars and all that. And also there had been a heat wave in Texas in June. Go figure, Texas heat in June, it happens. But the assertion was that climate change caused it and made it worse. Well, the fact is that for all 3 of those topics that were prominent in the news, the evidence was clear, convincing, objective, overwhelming that it was just the opposite of what the mainstream media was presenting. We know for a fact from ice data from Antarctica, by the way, that's supported by NASA studies. NASA themselves, NASA scientists themselves have shown that ice and snow in Antarctica has increased throughout the past century, even during recent decades. We know for a fact that cocoa production is setting new records virtually every year. And we also know for a fact from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's own website that heat waves, extreme heat days in Texas, are becoming less frequent and less severe. Back in the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, 100+ degree heat days in Texas were twice as frequent as they are today. So I presented that information, and at the end, and I'll repeat the challenge right now, because it's funny, at the ICA event, there were members of the European press, and some of them were friendly and open to hearing what we had to say, but others were the typical mainstream media you could see them visibly scoffing every time I present something. And oftentimes when I give information like this, they'll say, well, you're probably just cherry picking, or, well, that's what you say. So here's what I had to say, and the offer still stands. We have coming up next month, we have the Heartland Institute's 40th anniversary annual benefit dinner. Basically, public policy organizations, whether they're conservative, progressive, libertarian, whatever, each year, they typically have an annual benefit dinner. And our largest donors come into town, and this is where they show support for us, and we show our thanks for them. We put on a program. We have a keynote speaker. If there's any prominent scientist on the other side, prominent advocate on the other side, that would like to contest what I have to say, that would like to contest what is presented in a climate conversation, that would like to debate those points, come on and show up, because they don't show up and debate anymore. They don't, because they can't win. But if there's any chance that you might win, here's the thing. We've got all of the Heartland Institute's largest donors in a room right there. I invite you to come in for free. All you have to do is whoop my tail on a debate. Show that what I'm saying is wrong. Show that what's presented in a climate conversation is wrong. And all of our donors go away. The Heartland Institute will cease to exist. If you have anything at all supporting your point of view on the science, there's my challenge. You have nothing to lose and everything to gain. And I offer that challenge because I know the science is on our side.
That's pretty bold, James.
That's very bold.
Thank you.
It's what's needed.
The offer stands. Contact me, jtaylor@heartlands.org. Send me a note. Say, I accept your challenge. Let's do it.
Boy, I think you should sell even more tickets to that if you can make that happen. Hey, James, you mentioned something that I think is important, that all of this whole climate narrative ultimately is taking away freedom. And it's all under this guise of climate change. What I've realized, though, is they really want to limit our own personal climate. If we can be cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And so they're trying to really control our personal climates, which we really have taken for granted.
Yeah. The EPA has put out their guidance, which if the climate activists had their way, would be more than guidance. And it may not be too far in the future that it becomes mandatory. I forget the exact numbers, but it's ridiculous. In the summer, your thermostat needs to be set at something like 80 degrees. I mean, there are some people that are comfortable with 80, but there are many others for whom that would be very difficult. I'm one of those people. In the winter, that they're saying that you should set your thermostat at 55 degrees. It's funny, when I was a kid growing up, I was raised by a single mom raising 3 kids on a minimum wage salary. I grew up in the housing projects on welfare, drinking powdered milk, living off food stamps. And in those housing projects, that's what we had in the winter, because back then that was under Jimmy Carter. And he said that we need to set our thermostat at 55. That was the number. And so in the winter, we couldn't control our thermostat. The government did. And I remember sleeping under 3 blankets with my head under the blankets. I'd have to come up for air every now and then just to breathe. But if I left my head outside the blankets, I felt like I would literally freeze to death. In the summer, just sweltering, lying in a pool of sweat because, again, we couldn't reduce the air conditioning. And it is about taking away our personal freedom. And it's about forcing people to live in a manner as if the Industrial Revolution never occurred, as if human technology never advanced from more than about 200 years ago. And again, if we are roasting the planet, and if these types of things, if sleeping comfortably is destroying the planet, well, I guess you have to do what you have to do. But look into the science, look under the hood. That's what we did at the Heartland Institute. They say, why did it become a political issue? Well, it's a matter of science. And we stand up for the science, just like a climate conversation does. And ultimately, if we give in, if we just let them get away with telling falsehoods about climate change and some apocalyptic future, this is what we're all going to have to live with. We're going to have to live the way I lived as a child. And believe me, it was not fun.
And it doesn't have to be that way. That's the other thing that's so important. Another thing that I know, this is something really important to Walt, and that's the cost of all this. And we've determined that the green in the Green New Deal is the green that's going into people's pockets. So, Walt, I know that's important to you to talk about.
Yes, it is. In our film, we determined that the price to go net zero by 2050 for the U.S. would be $290 trillion. And as Ken said, that would be 1.1 million for every adult in the U.S. But you look into the details, and only half of the adults in the U.S. pay income tax. So it becomes quite a chore and a big part of our national GDP to do that. And right now, the benefits are just now starting to come out. And that would be like less than 1 degree Fahrenheit, as near as I can tell, the benefit, if any. Probably the natural variations in the Earth's temperature are going to outshine whatever we accomplish there. And so, yes, you have to ask yourself, what is behind doing all of this? And I think James made a very good point there, that this is designed to control us into a top-down organization, a totalitarian system. So, yeah, I think these are some important things to be talking about.
So it's an interesting thing. It came to me this week as we prepared for our conversation with you here today, James, that there is a parallel. There is a phenomenon that occurred in the United States since about 1960, late 50s, early 60s. A fellow named Gordon Moore, who was one of the founding entrepreneurs and geniuses at Intel Corporation came up with a thing called Moore's Law that said that computing power would double in its power and be cut in half in its cost every 18 months. And it came true. Computing power today is something on the order of 40 quadrillion times higher than it was in 1960. 40 quadrillion is a pretty big number. But I think that these estimates for costs of energy transition are exceeding Gordon Moore's law. The film was produced, I think Ken Gregory was put on tape about 2 years ago, Walt.
Right.
290 billion. That number is about 600 trillion now. It's I expect it to be, what is after a trillion? I guess it's a quadrillion, right? That number would be a quadrillion within 18 months. So, so what, you were just in Europe, James. I was just in Europe. Europe is not the Europe of my wandering college days. Europe's a changed place. But it's interesting to me, particularly I was in Holland, which has become the breadbasket of Europe somehow. It's a remarkable place. There's a change happening. There's a political change happening in Europe. What were your observations when you were over there?
Yeah, you hit it right on the head. Back 4 or 5 years ago, I've been attending these ICA conferences for probably, my goodness, 10, 15 years. So up until about just a couple of years ago, throughout all that time that I've been going to Europe, I would hear from people at these conferences, James, we agree with you. The problem is here in Europe, everyone is brainwashed. And it's even the conservatives. It's even the Tory party in the UK. It's even the conservative parties, whatever they're called, in the various other European countries. The best we can do is try to point out some of the worst aspects of the proposed climate transition, the green transition, and just try to keep the worst of it from happening. But that changed just in the past couple years, where now the truth is getting out, where people are questioning the underlying science propaganda, science messaging itself, challenging the United Nations IPCC's narrative to say, well, let's make sure that it's backed up. And people more and more frequently are coming to the conclusion that, wow, what we've been told here in Europe just isn't true. And if viewers are paying attention to European politics and elections, you have seen that just this year, the European Parliament elections, the right of center parties gained dramatic ground throughout the European Parliament. And the two issues there that they have been running on, one is immigration, in which the European borders are being abridged just as they are here in the United States. But second is opposition to the so-called green transition. People are fed up. They've had enough with energy prices, electricity prices that are 3 and 4 times what they are here in the United States. If you think your electric bill is high here, imagine paying 3 or 4 times that amount. Same thing for gasoline. It's more than double the cost of what it is here in the United States. And all of these predicted apocalyptic things that would happen due to climate change just haven't happened. So in Europe, you're seeing at the grassroots level a big change. And it's not just a change in public opinion. It's having impact in the political sphere, which is quite encouraging. One note, if I can add to this, you mentioned the doubling of computing power in 18 months and the reduction of costs. You would think that because of all of the energy that this increase in computation, especially now with more data centers and AI, you would think that the tech industry would be on our side in promoting affordable, reliable energy. But it's just the opposite. For whatever reason, the tech industry, as they have censored all sorts of people and institutions that tend to be more conservative, they have been among the biggest promoters of wind and solar power. They have censored and suppressed the speech of people who challenge wind and solar power or who point out the negative environmental or economic consequences. And they censor us here at the Heartland Institute. And yet at the same time, now they're the ones that, due to these increases in data centers and AI, the operators of the national electric grid say that we are now going to face a very dramatic sudden increase in demand on the grid. For the past 20 years, electric demand on the grid has been essentially flat. but now we're predicting a very significant increase. So basically, the same tech industry that vandalized the grid by suppressing the speech of people who promoted reliable, affordable energy to keep the grid growing are now destroying the grid by at the same time packing more demand on the grid, and the grid can no longer meet it. It used to be that 10, 20 years ago, if there was a brownout or a blackout anywhere, it was a huge scandal. People wanted answers and scalps would be taken. Now it happens all the time, and we're just told, well, you just have to deal with it. Sometimes that happens. If there's a winter storm, expect blackouts and brownouts. It's not a factor that winter storms make sure we have blackouts and brownouts. It is by not having affordable, reliable energy on the grid. And the reason why we don't have that is because of the people pushing the UN climate narrative.
One of the things, so I'm a newcomer. You've all been, knee deep in this conversation and this struggle, I suppose, for a long, long, long time. I've been busy going about my career as an advertising, marketing, and financial guy, but the last couple of years I'm deep in it, and it kills me the failure to acknowledge certain realities, which is the 100% agreement of people who have an alarmist view of climate and a positive view of immigration. It's a 100% correlation. I can't think of anyone who's skeptical about climate who's pro open borders. And I can't think of anybody who's pro open borders who is not also a climate alarmist. And there's actually whole buckets of these categories that you can put people in. And the takeaway I have is that this isn't science, it's religion. It's that I receive a catechism, I'm told what and how to believe, I'm given absolution in the form of acceptance on Twitter if I go along, and we have a groundswell. The science is decided, the debate is over, you're a crank or a crackpot or a denier. The worst things that people can think of to describe someone who's asked the question, do we actually have $290 trillion? Is there enough cobalt under the crust of the earth to build all the energy infrastructure that is mandated? Will the Chinese stop building coal-fired power plants? And yet, if you ask those questions, it's heresy. So what is the daily life of James Taylor like? Long question. As you wander down life's roads across the world, what's it like to kind of have so many people against you?
Well, at the risk of running long, let me first address, you mentioned about how it's become a bit of a religion, a belief system. And it's true. When I was in college, an undergrad at an Ivy League school, I studied atmospheric science. So I was presented with information. I was presented with the ability to go and dig into the truth on matters of climate science and other meteorology and other atmospheric sciences. When I was in law school, I was the editor-in-chief of a student newspaper. And I decided that as the climate crisis, as global warming was becoming a popular issue, I wanted to write an article to convince my fellow conservatives and libertarians that, hey, look, I don't like government action either, but we're destroying the planet. We have to do something. So having studied atmospheric science in undergrad, I knew what journals to go to, what pure science journals. I knew where to find the actual data. And I went and did the research for the article because I didn't just want to be quoting CNN or USA Today. And when I looked at the actual data, I said, wait a second. Yeah, we're getting some warming, not nearly as much as we're told. Yes, humans may be playing some role, but the fact of the matter is this is nowhere near a crisis. It's probably beneficial. And temperatures have been warmer than today for most of the time that human civilization has existed. So taking that information, I wrote an article that was exactly the opposite of what I intended to do. Now, at the Heartland Institute, if people are proposing something that's going to take away our freedoms, look, if it's something that we're facing a crisis, I guess we have to sometimes compromise. But conservatives, libertarians, they want to look under the hood to make sure it's justified. And if, on the contrary, if you believe in big government, if you're a statist, if you don't mind large taxes, if you don't mind what you believe are the best and the brightest in government steering our lives, well, then you don't have any incentive to look under the hood, because what's being proposed is something you like, whether there's a climate crisis or not. And I think that's what I've discovered in this debate and discussion. Now, a day in the life of James Taylor, boy, there's quite a bit going on. Each day at the Heartland Institute, we do an internet search we do climate change, and we see what's popping up as the top news items. And then we'll go out and debunk them and give people the ammunition for what they need to know. So, for example, just the other day, I was doing my morning Google search for climate change, Google News, and there was an article by the New York Times. It was gaining a lot of traction. And it was titled something like, "This is how your favorite scent disappears." And the article asserted that climate change is making vanilla is putting it on the verge of extinction. Vanilla being, they presented some evidence that it's the world's favorite scent. And their evidence for this was they noted that a hurricane struck Madagascar, which is the largest vanilla producing nation, in 2017. So 7 years ago, during hurricane season, a hurricane struck Madagascar, and there was a very temporary spike in vanilla prices. Based upon that, they say climate change is making vanilla go extinct. Okay, well, what we do at the Heartland Institute, what I do is I went to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. They keep very detailed records on all the crops in the world that are produced by all the countries in the world. So when someone says something like this, whether it's cocoa, coffee, beer, wine, whatever it may be, you can actually check it out. We do that. And what I found is that since the year 2000, we're talking just 24 years, global production of vanilla has doubled, fully doubled. And in fact, if you were to also do a Google search on prices and farmers, vanilla farmers, they're complaining now that there's so much oversupply of vanilla that they can't make a living. They can't produce, they can't get any money for the vanilla that they're producing because there's so much on the market. This is the garbage that people, if they're just reading the New York Times, and if they don't make an effort to really look into the facts, this is the garbage they believe. And this is what the climate activists hope will be the motivating factor for people to get on board fighting a climate crisis. They will pick things that people love: beer, wine, chocolate, coffee, cranberry sauce, maple syrup, vanilla. We have debunked propaganda about all of those. So that's one of the aspects that I do. I will be in contact daily with scientists, climate scientists, the most learned scientists in the world. They'll share information with me, because not all scientists are eloquent presenters. Walt Johnson is fantastic at presenting the science as well as what people need to know in a way that people can understand. But a lot of scientists can't. So they say, "James, Heartland Institute, here is my new research. Here is this new paper. Will you please spread the word so that people will understand?" So we'll do that. We'll also be in touch with policymakers throughout the country to get that information to them. There's a lot that goes into being James Taylor. Some of it's fun, some of it's frustrating because of all the steps involved. But ultimately, it's rewarding, just as I'm sure it's rewarding for each of you when you know that you're presenting truth. And hopefully when you see the dial move as far as the public's understanding of what truth is.
Well said. Well said. So do you think there's hope? I mean, when I say hope, I feel like time is the enemy of the alarmist, but I don't know that that's true. Walt, I don't know if you have an opinion you want to share about this, but I remember Kevin Bacon, who I think is a great actor, he's a cool dude, predicting that the oceans would die by, I think he did it in like year 2000. He said the oceans would be dead by the year 2010. Well, I live near the ocean. It's right over there. It's not dead. Prediction after prediction after prediction after prediction fails to come true. At some point, does this catch up? Is credibility lost? Walt, do you think that?
I think you're right on there. In fact, if you go back far enough, Al Gore said we would not be able to live on the earth by now unless we did something. And we're getting along just fine. So time is on our side, because the natural variations in the Earth's temperature are going to catch up with all of this before too much longer. I've got a good friend that says by 2030, we're going to be in a cooling trend. And I've gone through his science on that. And it's not one of those things I would present to anybody, but he can substantiate it. In fact, I've run into another well-established scientist that says about the same thing, and he has a different set of arguments about why that would be. But before long, we're going to get cool.
I would add it's very important to keep track of and hold climate activists to their falsified predictions. Now they've gotten better at making their predictions so that the timeline to be so far in the future that they can't be fact checked, but still some are out there. So for example, in the Obama administration, when they put up signs throughout Glacier National Park saying that all of these glaciers will disappear by the year 2020, it's good to remind people that not only was this a claim made by climate activists, they spent taxpayer dollars to propagandize people at our national parks about this. They eventually had to take those signs down. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, I mentioned how they keep stats on crop production throughout the world, and that's very useful to have. But still, the bureaucrats in charge at the UN FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, they put out a prediction, I believe it was in 2011, 2014, it wasn't too long ago, saying that within a decade, we're going to see crop production falling around the globe. And by their own numbers, crop production still continues to set new records each and every year, well, almost every year, but the trend is inexorably upwards. These are the types of predictions we need to make sure that we keep track of and hold them accountable to. Just now, this morning, doing my Google News search for alarms to debunk was an assertion that this was put out by NASA. So again, these are your taxpayer dollars doing this, saying that by the year 2030, we're going to see reduction in crop production globally and throughout the United States. Now, 6-7 years from now, when that comes, they'll try to make us forget that they ever said it. But I put that down on my list of items to remember, because I can guarantee you, I'll bet every penny in my bank and every penny in Heartland's account, which isn't much compared to the other side, but I'll bet every dollar I have that's not going to be the case. In fact, I've made these bets. When there are these predictions that come out that can be falsified within 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, I routinely go out to people that'll make these comments about how the Heartland Institute spreading misinformation by challenging that. We're just a bunch of deniers. You name the bet. Any bet you want, any size, because they always are falsified. It's important to hold them to it.
Well,
James, a question though. If these policies continue on that are being pushed by the climate alarmists, the reduction of the use of fertilizer, that will actually affect food production. And my concern is that it's these policies that would create the reality that they're talking about in 2030. And that's scary, actually.
Yeah, that's a good point. I gotta watch out for that one, because I could get duped into reduced crop production for other reasons. But I'd still make that bet, because although they're trying to reduce fertilization, do all sorts of other, put in place all sorts of other restrictions on farming, seeing how Europeans have reacted, fighting back against that, I would hope that enough people will fight back against that so that we won't have our technologies taken away from us. But that's a very good point. And then what will happen is you're right. If crop production declines because you can no longer use nitrogen for fertilizer, because we can't use pesticides anymore. We have to be all organic, which is far less productive than using our modern technologies. Then when you have crop production or crop reduction, then they're going to blame climate change.
James, we tried to bring an eclectic group of people together in the climate conversation because we wanted to reflect the people. This can't be a bunch of bureaucrats in the United Nations with a not well hidden agenda about the United States as a hegemon making decisions that affect us all. So we had Trent Luce on this podcast, who's a very interesting figure. I strongly encourage everybody you want to be entertained? You want to see some cool podcasting? Listen to Trent Luce for a little while. Very strong opinions about this, but they're not just opinions. If you remove the natural gas components of creation of fertilizer, nitrogen, basically, based fertilizers, 4 billion people are going to die. All right. So you got a problem, potentially. I mean, that's not dollars. That's human cost.
Yeah.
We had David Legates on, and David Legates has written a brilliant new compendium about climate realism. And, what are we going to do about the sun? What are we going to do about the moon? And what are we going to do about, the orbit around the sun? These things affect climate. What we had James Camus, a plate climatologist, on to demonstrate why there's been in West Antarctica a diminution of the ice, to prove it, to talk about, like, where does El Nino come from? I don't think one person in a million knows anything about plate climatology. And I don't think anybody's considered the impact on the billions of people who live in Africa if they can't be introduced to modern agricultural tools and technologies. So you got a big job cut out for you there at Heartland. And, I'm glad you're doing it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's enjoyable again to be telling the truth. I mentioned you brought up my talk in Vienna with Ika, and one of the three topics I debunked was the notion that Antarctica is losing ice, and you just mentioned West Antarctica. But it just calls to mind a little more specificity on that. So basically, there was this fact check website where people think that whatever they say are the facts, when they're just opinions. In fact, they've argued that in court, because when John Stossel, for example, sued, I believe it was Facebook, for fact checking him and doing so in a manner that was dishonest, they said, well, no, we're not saying that what we're saying is a fact. It's just our opinion on what other people say. Anyway, so we were fact checked at Heartland because we have on our Climate at a Glance website, climateataglance.com, where we have basically 2-page summaries of various climate topics: Antarctic ice, hurricanes, tornadoes. Each one gets a couple pages. So this fact check organization said that we were presenting misinformation and disinformation because we were denying the loss of mass in the Antarctic ice sheet. Well, what was funny was either the same day or maybe one day before or after that fact check came out, there was a study published. This is a peer-reviewed study where scientists had found photographs back in the 1920s or 30s. Scientists had, for the first time with airplanes, been able to fly back and forth across the Antarctic continent. They took all sorts of photos for scientific purposes. Then they went back and did so today. And because Antarctica is very mountainous, so you would see the snow, you could see where the snow and ice was versus specific features of mountain ranges and individual mountains and ridges. And what they saw is that there is significantly more snow and ice now than there was in the 1920s and 30s. They could tell just by taking a look at how much there is against the backdrop of the mountains. There's a lot more. And it also was supporting what a NASA scientist co-authored peer-reviewed study in 2015, where they looked at year by year, going far, not as far back as the 20s and 30s, but going back 30 years or so. And they said, yes, we've had a significant increase in snow and ice throughout Antarctica, basically every decade. And it's funny that, so when we produced the actual data, some fact check person, when they gave their snippy little response, when they'll contact us and I'll present the data, then they'll say, oh, and they'll come up with some bureaucrat at NASA, not the scientist who did the study, but some bureaucrat at NASA says, climate change is making the Antarctic ice sheet melt. Well, there you go. We fact checked it, and everything that the Heartland Institute says, everything these scientists say, everything the peer-reviewed studies say is false. So that's the frustrating part of waging this battle for truth every day, is because we present objective data, and if the data turns, if it becomes apparent that we're causing some climate crisis, look, I have children. Someday I'll probably have grandchildren. I want them to live in a better world than I have today. I'll be the first one to say, you know what, I was wrong, and I'm sorry, but I was pursuing science. That's where the truth seemed to be, but it turned out I was wrong. If that happens, I'll say that. But the frustrating part is when I present data, when the Heartland Institute presents data, when a climate conversation presents objective data, still you have people that don't really care about that. They're more interested in presenting a narrative for whatever political or other agendas they have.
James, I think you probably have alluded to this when you've talked about the Heartland Institute is about freedom. But for people that are just starting to hear this narrative as we're pushing back, they're saying, well, why? Why is this agenda occurring? Why? What do you say to the why?
There are a lot of different reasons, I believe. I mean, I can't see into other people's minds, and I hate to say, okay, here's how most people view the world or why. But from my interactions with people, here's basically the way I think it breaks down. There are very intelligent people with access to information on both sides of the debate. The scientists at some of the leading universities and government institutions that say we're facing a climate crisis, I think they truly believe we are. I think that sometimes you can read the information two ways, or if you are inclined to see it two ways. I don't see how anyone could see it the other way, but I guess you can. Also, when you look at the amount of funding that has gone to NASA and NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that is based entirely on the perpetuation of a climate crisis, I think people who work for those institutions are going to look at the issue with rose-colored glasses to their own point of view and maybe not be interested in investigating what some of the science is that contradicts what they have to say. Back in the days when people used to debate this topic, I would salivate at the thought of debating a climate scientist from Princeton or from Yale or from some other prestigious institution, because nobody ever challenges their point of view. And if they believe in a climate crisis, they're not challenging it themselves. If they work for NASA or NOAA, the same thing. For some people, it is an opportunity to pursue an agenda of government control, of government authority. Climate change is a very convenient mechanism to do it. I doubt whether Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has delved deeply into the climate science, but for her, hey, look, here is messaging that allows for socialism. So there are a lot of reasons, but I think what I encourage people to do is look at the facts for yourself, and don't just look at the statements coming from the bureaucracy of NASA. I mean, NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration. Guess what, people? We don't send people to the moon anymore. It wouldn't even exist if not for the perpetuation of a climate crisis. If NASA comes out as an organization and says, you know what? Yeah, we're causing some climate change, but it's not a crisis. People lose their jobs. People lose their salaries. They no longer get to be famous rock stars at these conferences. So there's a lot that goes into it. I think some people are just blatantly presenting false information, but I don't think many people really see it that way. I think they talk themselves into believing what they're peddling.
Maybe if we could bring meditations back into the high school curriculum and people could be introduced to the idea of virtue, it might do some good. But I wonder, what's it like to walk across the campus at University of Texas and see Judy Curry, who's brilliant and kind and so thoughtful and articulate, and think, oops, her opinion of me matters. Or in Princeton, William Happer walking across the quad, a giant of American science and physics, and realize that how do you face Will Happer if you're a physicist and say, Will, you're wrong? I do understand the economics of people fall in love with their paycheck, for sure. I love my paycheck. Most people do. But I think there needs to be a reckoning about this whole concept of misinformation. This is a new word as far as I know. It reminds me of like Soviet enterprises of Pravda in the 30s and 40s. Pravda, I believe, means truth in Russian, which is interesting all by itself. But I do you hold hope? So this is my question. Sorry for the pontification. Do you hold hope that this election cycle might produce something concrete in terms of rational energy policy in the United States?
Well, I hope so. I think there's a chance that that'll happen. At Heartland, we're not Republican or Democrat supporting organization, nor do we support particular candidates. That being said, we'll support sound energy policy, and it's nice to see when one or more candidates go in that direction. It used to be, it's funny. So just taking away, let's step out of myself as president of Heartland. Let's just, me personally, without any connection there. When I would talk with folks at Tea Party events back in 2015 or so, and I saw this momentum building for Donald Trump, and I would say, people, what are you thinking? I mean, we have probably the deepest, strongest lineup of conservative, of freedom-oriented candidates, certainly that I've seen in my lifetime. And here you have somebody that doesn't really have a history of being conservative. Who knows what we're getting? And yet you're all on fire for this guy. And when Donald Trump won, I was concerned on many fronts. But here's the thing. Prior to Donald Trump's administration, my hope would be that, well, seeing how whenever we had a Democratic administration in power, that there would be this steep curve. So going like this for an increase in government power and regulations on energy and the environment. And then if there's a Republican administration, instead of going like this steeply, it would be kind of like this. It's still increased, just not nearly as much. We saw that under George Bush, for example, with Christy Todd Whitman running the EPA. I never thought that there would even be an administration, Republican or Democrat, where the power of the state, the oppressiveness of the state would simply stay put for 4 years. Forget about an increase. Under the Trump administration, we saw regulations decrease. We saw restrictions on energy usage decline. We saw more exporting of American energy, more production of American energy. And by the way, if Kamala Harris comes out tomorrow and says, I'm all for it, and says so in a manner that's sincere and believable, I'll be touting her as well. So do I see hope of this? Well, we have a candidate who's about even in the polls who has a good track record for that. And my hope is that Republican and Democrat alike, that we'll see more of that. When I joined Heartland in 2001, in those first 5 to 10 years, I worked closely with Democrats who also believed in affordable, conventional, reliable energy. Unfortunately, they've been pretty much run out of the Democrat Party, but maybe they can get back in. Some of my closest legislators that I worked with and that became friends were Democrats. I'd love to see that day happen again.
We early in the conversation today, we mentioned Jimmy Carter, and remember him wearing the card. You're too young, but Walt and I will remember Jimmy Carter wearing, not you, Kim. Walt and I will remember him wearing a cardigan sweater.
I remember.
On TV.
I was born in 1967. I remember.
We're going to switch things around. It's going to be 80 on their thermostat in summer and 68 in winter. And, we're going to flip this thing because we're sad. And then not long after that, Ronald Reagan was elected, and it was Morning in America. And we went from really a misery index, and miserable kind of culture in those days, kind of hopelessness, hostages, stagflation, and oh my God, to a brilliant run of something crazy in terms of like 100 consecutive months of robust growth, including we had one, I think, 8% GDP increase year under Reagan, 83 or 84, something like that. It was spectacular. I don't know what it would take if that kind of pivot can happen again. But just thinking about it makes me feel pretty good.
Dave, I'm going to tell you a story. When I was growing up, so I said I was born in 1967, so I remember the Jimmy Carter years. And I remember when Ronald Reagan was elected. And again, my mom was raising my brothers and me in a housing project. And when Reagan won, some of our benefits got cut. Some of the housing subsidy, we still were able to live in the welfare project at a reduced rent, but it wasn't quite as reduced as it used to be. And some of the food stamps that we got were reduced as well. And in my house, the name Ronald Reagan became a 4-letter word. the way my mom viewed it. I mean, she was working 60, 70 hours a week, minimum wage job, hostess, cashier at a restaurant, and trying to raise 3 boys and herself. What happened over the next few years as the economy started growing like never before was it rather than being dependent on government subsidies and handouts to pay the bills, the economy took off. More people were going out to eat. More people were frequenting the restaurant my mom worked at, and other restaurants wanted to gain customers as well. So they saw my mom did a really good job. And now she started getting competing offers. People are coming to her and saying, hey, I'll give you a 30% pay raise if you come work for me. My mom would go to her boss and say that, and he'd give her a 40% increase. Before long, she was making more money based on that growing free market. And this isn't some hedge fund manager. This isn't somebody who's the head of a corporation. This is a minimum wage worker in the service industry. Because of those pro-growth policies, my household did so much better than we were doing with those handouts. And sometimes people would tell me, I remember when I was in law school and one of the partners in the firm, he couldn't believe that I had a free market perspective. Well, how can you say that? You're such a hypocrite. You benefited from those policies for all those years. Well, I think it is important to have a safety net, but it can't be a safety net that becomes a box that you can't escape from. It has to be something that is a net, a safety net, but when an economy grows, it does truly lift all ships. It did in my household. And by the time Ronald Reagan was running for re-election, as you mentioned, those growth rates, Ronald Reagan was no longer a 4-letter word in my household. Ronald Reagan was someone that my mom just absolutely loved. And I think the American people are discerning, they're wise, and ultimately there are a lot of battles we fight, scientific, personal freedom, whatever. But I think ultimately truth, and I think I don't know if I want to use the word morals, ethics, whatever, but the best society I think will win out. I have optimism.
That's a great story. I love that. We'll have to use that.
It is a wonderfully heartwarming story, James. An American story above all. I got to meet Ronald Reagan one time. I was young, but it profoundly affected me for a time. I felt like I'd been in an energy field. It's hard to describe. Walt, I don't know if you ever met him or shook his hand or had a conversation with him, but he embodied something that it would be good to get back. This sort of hopeful, cheerful, positive attitude that America's been known for. I don't know if there's a store where we can go to buy our freedom back. But your story is an example of the costs and the benefits of freedom, right? So you were made uncomfortable for a while with more freedom in the form of the economic expansion in the United States, but it ended up being a really wonderful thing. And I think that's probably what's going to ultimately happen here. A little bit warmer planet is going to mean a little bit greener planet with more food and more flourishing for people. If we can get more people to watch this movie and get more people to share this news and get more people to open their minds and their hearts a little bit, take the risk of ostracization because you're a denier, and embrace the role of a lover of truth and science, I think really, really good things can happen. I'm so glad for the work that you're doing and the movie that Walt has so bravely made, and the daily grind for freedom that happens on Kim's radio show. It's a great group of people to be associated with. I'm very pleased that my career has taken this turn.
So Dave, thank you. And Walt, again, thank you for your vision for a climate conversation and working with James Taylor. James, thanks for your dedication to this project and to this important narrative. It really is about freedom. And it's amazing what happens when people have the freedom to go after their hopes and dreams. So thank you for the work that you do at the Heartland Institute.
Oh, thank you. It's been such a pleasure working with you folks, getting to know Walt personally, seeing so much of what he has given of himself for this movie because he cares. He cares about the fate of humanity. He cares about truth. Walt, it's just such an honor to know you and to be able to call you a friend. And thank you for taking me aboard to work with you here.
Thank you, James. Thank you for accepting me.
Absolutely. And we hope that you all enjoy a Climate Conversation podcast, which is a great compliment to the movie. And be sure to share this with all your friends and family, because this conversation, these discussions are so important. And we can do it without all the rant and rhetoric. We can get right to a climate conversation. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.